It's time now for the news review of this bulletin. The United Nations has released its annual report on children and armed conflict, but it has drawn criticism for omitting Israel from the list of shame for killing nearly 80 Palestinian children. The Palestinian deaths are among more than 2,500 child killings that were verified by the UN across the world in 2021. But Israel is not on a blacklist of child killers. The UN chief, Antonio Guterres, has said that Israel will be added to the list for the 2022 report if it repeats its high numbers of violations. That has drawn strong criticism from human rights bodies. They say that omitting Israel is another missed opportunity for accountability. The groups say that Israel, year after year, has gotten away with committing serious crimes against children with virtual impunity. The UN has in recent years also faced criticism for omitting Saudi Arabia from its child killers list, despite kids being killed in Yemen. Muti Abu Musaba is a political activist who joins us from Gaza City. We also have Mick Napier from the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, who joins us from Edinburgh. I'd like to welcome to you both. Muti Abu Musaba, let me first start with you. When you take a look at the fact that you have what is happening in particular in Gaza and the suffering of the children there, which has led to obviously deaths, there's no denying in the Gaza wars that Israel obviously was responsible for the killing of many children. It brings about the question as to whether the UN is acting as an impartial body when it is aware of the child killing that is taking place by Israel and yet continues to omit Israel from the list year after year.
Yes, first of all, thanks for having me. Actually, excluding the Israeli occupation from such an investigation and lifting off the Israeli occupation from that list, I think, is a crime itself. Because anyone worldwide has the little wit of humanity, understands and realizes clearly that the real position and the true position of the Israeli occupation should be at the top of that list. Because Israel has a long history of targeting and killing the Palestinian people as a whole and the Palestinian children specifically. Since the beginning of 2022, more than 13 Palestinian children were killed. In 2021, in the May aggression, more than 67 Palestinian children were slaughtered and buried alive under the rubbles of their residential houses after they were striked and bounded by the Israeli airstrikes in full view of the whole world. In the 2014 aggression, as Palestinians commemorate the 8th anniversary of that aggression, more than 550 Palestinian children were killed deliberately by the Israeli occupation. But it seems that all those crimes are not enough to draw the attention of Mr. Guterres and his fellows in UN to hold the Israeli occupation accountable and responsible for those crimes. And the spontaneous question we have here is, how many crimes should Israel commit against the Palestinian children in order to be held accountable and investigated for those crimes? I think we are in front of a new complicity of the UN towards the Israeli occupation at the expense of the Palestinian children, at the expense of the blood of the Palestinian children, as if the Palestinian blood is cheap in order to be investigated by the UN committees.
Okay, well, I'm taking a look, McNabb, here at the UN in its title, which is called Thousands of Children Endure Horrific Conditions in Conflict Zones, based on the UN report. I'm also looking at a report from PCHR.org, which is a weekly tracker of what happens in the occupied territories, of which just this past week, up to July 6th, I should say, the report has indicated that there have been 2 Palestinians that were killed and 34 others wounded, including 2 children. So this brings about the question, does the UN not realize what is happening in the occupied territories? Does the UN chief then come out and say, if you don't put, if Israel continues this trend, we're going to put Israel in the list next year. Whether he is ignoring or in a way offending the general public, which is aware of what's going on in the occupied territories, by making such statements regarding Israel.
Well, as your guest speaking from Gaza said, the complicity is a crime. But you know that there is an abundance of evidence, and the United Nations has discovered and uncovered massive amounts of evidence and published them. The UNHCR a couple of years ago published a report that said, and I quote, Israel was killing journalists, medical workers, and children, knowing they were children, knowing they were journalists, knowing they were medical workers. As long ago as 2001, an American Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Chris Hedges, reported from Gaza, and he said he had seen children massacred in many countries, in Guatemala, in Algeria, and so on, but only in Rafah, only in Gaza, he said, children murdered for sport by Israeli soldiers. So the evidence has been piling up faster than the bodies have been piling up. And report after report makes it absolutely clear that Israel is deliberately killing children. A few years ago, the notorious case of Iman al-Hams was public and was briefly discussed around the world only because some discussions between Israeli soldiers were recorded and played on TV. And they killed this school child, Iman al-Hams. And then an officer went over and killed her, made sure she was dead, and fired 15 bullets into her body to confirm the kill. The officer said to his soldiers, kill everything here, even if it is 3 years old. This was played on Israeli television, this was played around the world, and the soldiers involved were exonerated. Evidence after evidence piles up to say that Israel is deliberately killing children. They're not the only ones doing it, but they should be top of the list. And you know, okay, my government still sells sniper rifle parts to the Israeli military after these reports have been published. So yes, Israel's getting a get out of jail card. It's absolutely disgraceful what Gutierrez and the other enablers of these Israeli crimes have done.
Very well. Let's find out what's happening online with this in terms of the social media posts. We will get right back to our conversation. Our first post. The UN is run by the US, which gives Israel complete legal impunity for the ongoing pedo-sadist attacks against Palestinian children. Did the UN probe U.S. atrocities in Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and Iraq? U.S. arms have killed countless children in all countries where U.S. landed its forces or mercenaries. To hell with selective justice. No one cares about the Africans. It's all about the Ukraine-Russia war. And how about Palestinian children, Yemeni children, and the rest? Got to be fair, UN. All right, so those were some of our posts online. Muti Abu Musaba, we can't not have Yemen in this conversation because Yemen has suffered immensely. If you can give your thoughts on that, based on the war that has been led by by Saudi Arabia, backed by the U.S. arms in particular. Again, why are we not seeing Saudi Arabia be part of this list, of which, based on the consequences of the war, you have Yemeni children that are just dying away in high numbers, called the worst humanitarian crisis in the world?
Yes, I think it's crystal clear that the political factor is clearly existed here, and drives the way the UN selects to investigate such crimes. Today we are clearly observing how the double standards are clearly existed here. I think the first thing for the UN, in order to be just and objective in such investigation, is to try to be neutral, to stand at least at the same distance from the all parties involved in in such probe and investigation. I think as long as the UN bows under the pressure of the US administration and the domination of the Israeli occupation, the justice will remain absent, will remain unattainable, and the crimes would be continuously committed against the Palestinian people, the Yemenis, and the whole fragile sectors worldwide.
And McNabb here, in conclusion here, one of our guests comments saying the UN is run by the U.S., which gives Israel complete legal impunity. We also understand that Saudi Arabia also contributes to the budget of the UN, along with the U.S. for that matter. Are we looking at just budgetary motives for the UN chief or the UN as a whole, through whichever or whomever that is leading the organization, to make such statements when it comes to two obvious entities here by the name of Israel and Saudi Arabia, who are guilty of crimes against children in particular?
Well, there is that, but there's so much more. I mean, when I happened to be with Professor Richard Falk a few years ago, the very day that a UN body published a report that Israel was operating a system of apartheid from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. That report, which was adopted by the Commission for West Asia, was suppressed by Gutierrez. The US and various other countries piled on the UN, and shamefully, this report was buried. There was no question of objectivity, no question of honesty or integrity. This was acting at the behest of the US to protect Israel. We see this time after time. Look, Israel has a particular impunity. When it comes to nuclear weapons, even potential nuclear weapons, we can discuss any country in the world, but Israel's vast nuclear arsenal is never discussed in the mainstream media in the West. So we know that Israel is being protected, and the killing of Palestinian children and journalists and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people is enabled by the main governments of the Western world. This is absolutely clear, and only a very ignorant person who knows nothing, or somebody who's absolutely dishonest, denies this. It's so undeniable. It's in front of our faces.
Thank you very much for that. That's McNabb, Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and Moti Abu Musaba. Thank you, political activist from Gaza City. Thank you both. And with that, we come to an end for this news review. Thanks for tuning in.